Hello, and welcome to Philosophy 1050, an introduction to philosophy. This is Lecture 2, where we will be covering the Presocratics. Before I begin, I'd like to read the opening quote from the chapter for our reading this week. Philosophy begins with wonder, and even now it is wonder that causes philosophers to philosophize. At first they wondered about the obvious difficulties, and then they gradually progressed to puzzle about the greater ones. For example, the behavior of the moon and stars and sun, and the coming to be of the universe. Whoever is puzzled and in a state of wonder believes he is ignorant. This is why the lovers of myths is also in a way a philosopher, since myths are made up of wonders. And so, if indeed they pursued philosophy to escape ignorance, they were obviously pursuing scientific knowledge in order to know, and not for the sake of any practical need. As you can see from this opening quote, written by Aristotle, who we will cover later, the starting point of the Greek philosophical tradition was simply wonder and confusion at the world around us. A fundamental question, then, for the pre-Socratic philosophers was, what is the world? What is the world? Now, it seems a little bit of a silly question, perhaps, in this day and age where we have science and all that stuff. But back then, they didn't know a lot of stuff, so all they could really do is sit around and look at stuff and guess how it got to be there and what it is. They would look at the stars. Imagine looking at the stars and not knowing anything about astronomy. So, the answers to this question can be divided along many lines. But early on, one of the most important ones is known as monism versus pluralism. So we have monism and pluralism. And basically what these words mean, monism implies that there is only one kind of thing, and depending on how you take it, it could just be, not only is there only one kind of thing, but there's only one thing, period. Everything is actually just one thing. Now, pluralism, it says that the world is actually made up not out of just one type of thing or one thing, but out of many type of things. So, something like believing that the world is made up of fire, earth, wind, and water would make you count as a pluralist. But it gets a little bit more complicated than that, so let's continue on and we'll have it be a little bit clearer. So, besides, let's see here. To return then to the topic of pre-Socratic philosophy, we are told that philosophy began at the Ionian coast of the Aegean Sea, or in other words, the western coast of Turkey, or at least what is now known as Turkey, towards Greece. So at this point, I should mention that what is important in this course is not so much the historical details. This isn't really a history course. This is a philosophy course. So what's important is the ideas behind the thinkers that we explore. Knowing the places and the dates, it's helpful, and it helps you put things into context, but only to a certain extent. Because if what we're interested in is the ideas, then the places and dates, they don't really help us that much. Regardless, philosophy as philosophy, the actual word, is a Greek tradition. It started in Greece. The word philosophy, as I explained in my last class, is the Greek word for the love of wisdom. And the world is a big place, however, and arguably many cultures have contributed important philosophical thoughts, or what should be accepted as philosophical thoughts, such as the Buddhist philosophies, which began in the 4th century BC. We won't be covering those in this course. There's whole other courses centered around Eastern philosophy and Buddhist philosophy. And so if you're interested in that, you can take one of those courses next term. Um, let's see here. In any case, our textbook has a point when it says that there is something particular about the Greek emphasis on epistemology and formulated logic. So the distinction that the textbook wants to draw between other forms of philosophy from other cultures and the philosophy that arose from the Greeks is that the Greeks were particularly worried about how they can be sure they're right about something. So they had logic, and they had something called, as we covered last class, epistemology, which is the art of knowing reliably. That's one definition you could give. So Socrates, which we'll cover in the next course, also contributed an important thing, which is called the dialectic method. Basically, it's just incessant questioning of someone who claims to know something. And this is meant to tease out the truth, or the lack thereof. Aristotle, conversely, created a formal set of rules for logic, so that arguments could be presented with perfect clarity, so there's no confusion about what's being said. We will cover each one of these in our course in more detail later. To once again focus back on the Presocratics, the philosophers that, as the name implies, came before Socrates, let's cover a group of them that were known as the Hylacists, otherwise known as materialists. So the Hylacists draw their name from the word hule in Greek. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. But basically the word hule means matter, stuff. And so these philosophers were not really happy with the traditional religious explanations of what the world is and how it works. So they wanted something called naturalistic explanations, or in other words, explanations that appealed to the real stuff in the world, the stuff that you can actually see and feel. A saying that is attributed to Thales of Miletus, who was a Hylacist, in fact a very famous one of Miletus. By the way, I'm going to write down the times they were born, but again, don't worry too much about the dates. So Thales of Miletus had a famous saying that all things are full of gods. And basically that's his way of saying that if we want to learn about the world, then we have to look at things in the world. And in order not to upset people too much, he would say, well, actually I'm studying the gods, because the gods are in everything. So this really indicates his dedication to looking for truth inside of the world. Now, arguably these philosophers were vindicated when on and this is a very specific date, May 23rd, 585 BC, as mentioned, Thales of Miletus successfully predicted an eclipse ahead of time. As you can imagine, back in the day, the ability to do this was seen as a huge wonder. And so he gained a lot of prestige for himself and for philosophy in general. Indeed, some choose this date as the official day that philosophy started. So again, May 23rd, 585 BC. Now, I don't know if I agree with this being the start of philosophy, but that's certainly a date that some people give. Because that was the first major success that made people perk up their heads and be like, oh, what are these weird kooky guys doing predicting solar eclipses and stuff? So that's probably why people like to choose this date. In any case, some of you might at this point be scratching your heads and isn't predicting solar eclipses just the work of scientists? I mean, even the philosophy these Hylacists talk about, the materialism, seems to be a lot like science. So what's the deal here? Well, the thing is that originally there wasn't actually a distinction between philosophy and science. In fact, the philosophers that did the job of what we now today call scientists were called natural philosophers. Science just was philosophy. And the name natural philosopher actually continued well into the medieval period, where eventually the Renaissance and the Enlightenment caused it so that people started looking differently at science and focusing on it a little bit more. And for that reason, it kind of split off from philosophy. Now, there's a lot of reasons that go into that, and we don't have time to get into them now. But suffice to say, there's plenty of courses on the philosophy of science and how it developed. So, philosophers focused on natural explanations for the most part, at least within the Hylicist tradition, and so because of that, we kind of draw our tradition from them. So who was this Thales guy of Miletus, and what did he believe? Well, I mean, it will seem pretty silly what he believes, but here it is. And I'm actually going to make some space here. I presume you're going to be able to remember Thales of Miletus. So this is what the world was according to Thales of Miletus. So we have, like, let's say, an island here, right? We have some water on either side. Now, what did Thales think this was? What was the world? Well, he thought that everything in the world was actually water. So he thought that the water, obviously, was water, but also the land and the air. Now, how can he say that? Well, he can say that basically by spreading things apart. So for him, the land was water that was very close together. So there's a lot of water particles that when you condense them is what we see as land. The water itself was, like, let's say, averagely spread out. So when the water is spread out an average amount, we call that water, and it looks like water and it feels like water. When the water is very spread apart, we call that air, because it's very light and easy to go through. Now, it is interesting to note that, once again, there seems to be a striking resemblance between Thales' conception of the density of matter and what we know now today in terms of modern science. I mean, for Thales, all these dots were water. But now, with modern science, we know that these dots, roughly speaking, are something like atoms. The heavier and denser something is, the closer the atoms are together. The lighter and airy something is, the farther the atoms are apart. So he wasn't too far off. If we look at things in terms of the evidence he had, finding water not only at the edges of the land, but seemingly within the air, because the air is moist. He found it within the soil, because the soil is moist. And he also found it within all living things. If you crack open a seed and kind of squish it together, it feels wet. And so it was somewhat reasonable for Thales to think that everything might just be water. When you break it down, it's the building block of everything, according to Thales. Now, among his beliefs, according to Nietzsche at least, are an account not only of what exists and how it came to be, but also an account which doesn't appeal to religious explanations. And this is the key thing here. You don't need any gods in order to make this picture work. You're just saying what the world is by appealing to matter. And this is in true Hylicist fashion. Now, in addition to this, and less fortunately, Thales also believed that the world was flat. So, not everyone's perfect. But moving on from Thales, we have another philosopher known as Anaximander. Some of these Greek names can be hard to pronounce, but Anaximander. And he lived 612 to 545 BC. So, what was Anaximander's deal? Well, Anaximander agreed with Thales that we should look for material explanation, so he was a Hylicist, and he agreed that the world was made up of only one thing, so he was also a monist, like Thales. But he disagreed what that building block was. So for him, instead of water, he had the same picture, but instead of water, it was something he called the infinite, or the boundless. So, for Anaximander, Thales' focus on water was a little bit sort of premature. By him focusing on water, he's missing a lot of what's going on. So, according to Anaximander, it's not water, it's not fire, it's not earth, it's not wind. None of these things are the basic building block. The basic building block is something even more basic. It's something kind of like a fifth element, but let's not get too far into that. So for Anaximander, you have the same picture, it's just the picture has this more basic thing at the bottom of it all. And arguably, that's closer to our picture today in physics. So the things that make the elements, then, according to Anaximander, is some neutral fifth element, like I said. The fifth element comes together and makes up the elements from the bottom up. And the fifth element gives and takes, or creates and destroys, according to what Anaximander called the justice of time. This causes the universe to be stable because there's opposing forces that are kind of keeping it in balance. This concept of balance within a system is otherwise known as homeostasis. And thinkers at this time used this sort of thinking to try and understand not just the world, but also medicine and health. So health, under the idea of homeostasis, was a balance between forces in the body. If the forces within your body, if one of them becomes stronger than the others, then the diagnosis was that one of your humors was out of balance, and that led to sickness, according to their medical knowledge at the time. Found in Anaximander's thought was also the concept of the world as a vortex of heavy objects which settle down to the middle, roughly speaking, the bottom, and light objects which rise to the top. Setting aside the similarities we might be able to draw between this and our current notion of gravity, is yet another example of a naturalistic explanation of the world that was meant to be blind and impersonal, rather than dictated by the whims of something like gods, of divine intentions. Now, all that being said, Anaximander didn't do much better than Thales in terms of, what the Earth was like, because to Anaximander, the Earth was actually something like a cylinder where the length was 3 times the height, and we live here on the top. So I mean, that's not much better than a flat Earth, but at least it's not perfectly flat. Moving on, we now come to a philosopher that many of you should know from math class, and the name of this philosopher is Pythagoras. Yeah, Pythagoras is a philosopher, believe it or not. And he lived 580 to 496 BC. So, Pythagoras was considered a philosopher and held some very specific beliefs, like the soul is immortal. A soul can migrate and live as different species, so kind of like a reincarnation kind of thing. Events are repeated in cycles, so what has happened will happen again. All things with souls should be considered as related to each other. The soul is more important than the body. Men and women are equal. One should treat their slaves well, because yes, back in this time there were slaves. It was pretty common. Although being a slave was more like being in debt to someone rather than, in any case, I digress. And lastly, according to Pythagoras, living well involves the purification of your soul and your body. So how do you do that according to Pythagoras? Well, for the soul, you cleanse your soul by having knowledge or science and listening to music. As far as the body goes, you cleanse your body by doing gymnastics and practicing medicine. Now, that may seem a bit strange, but they really liked their gymnastics and their music back then. So if we are paying attention, we see that Pythagoras actually took a detour away from the earlier Hylacists that came before him, like Anaximander and Thales. Pythagoras rejected what is known as materialism in favor of a theory that brings in the immaterial. So his idea, and I'm actually going to erase this stuff here. His idea, his position is known as mathematical mysticism. It's known by many names, but that's one of them. And the idea here, first and foremost, is that the world is structured by mathematics, and more specifically by numbers. Numbers become points, which become lines, which become planes, which become solids. So a number, let's say number 1, the number 1 becomes a point. From the point, you get 2 points. And with 2 points, you can make a line. From a line, you can get 3 points. And with 3 points, you can get a 2D plane. And from there, if you add one more dot, you can make a 3D shape. So, and this kind of makes sense as far as how would you get from numbers to the real world. Well, you get through there by basically realizing that numbers are points, points become lines, lines become planes, and planes become solids. And solids are what we see in our world now. The basic elements, for example, were considered to be very specific 3D objects, known as polyhedrons by the Greeks. The cube was earth, the octahedron was air, the tetrahedron was fire, the icosahedron was water, the dodecahedron was universe. So Pythagoras reportedly became convinced that this is the way the world worked because of his knowledge of music, and this comes back to his idea about purifying your soul through music. He was able to find regular mathematical patterns within music and reasoned that the whole world must be structured this way. So, as we mentioned earlier, Pythagoras was moving away from the picture where the world was just stuff, but and touchable matter, to a picture where there was also this non-physical realm. It existed in the same way that numbers exist. The number 2, in some sense, exists over and above the real physical stuff here in the world. Now, Pythagoras' conception of stuff in the world was a combination of a philosopher named Anaximenes, which instead of having water or the infinite, his view was that everything was air, and another philosopher which we covered, Anaximander. According to Pythagoras, the matter in the world is actually something that he refers to as unlimited breadth, and that is what continues physical existence. I mean, that's really neither here nor there, but that is an interesting and important detail. So, Pythagoras had this idea of the sacred decad. So because there's this world of numbers that has incredible force, then each number must in some way correspond to something. So I'm going to briefly give you the decad here. I'm not going to write it down because it'll take too much time, but you can find it in the notes. So Pythagoras' sacred decad, 1 was the unity, it was both limited and unlimited. 2 was the line, as we said. 3 was the plane. 4 was the solid. 5 is qualities. 6 is animation or motion. 7 is intelligence. 8 is health. 9 is love. And 10, the best thing of them all, is wisdom. Notice then that in Pythagoras' system, the final good is wisdom, and this matches with his other beliefs about purification. specifically that the soul is better than the body, one ought to purify themselves from the world through the pursuit of philosophy, according to Pythagoras. This idea was very important, and it was passed on to Plato and went on to play a major role in many different Greek philosophies. Beyond that, and perhaps best known to you all, Pythagoras formulated a theorem about the sides of triangles, which relate to each other. So the classic a squared plus b squared equals c squared. A, B, C. I'm sure you all know that. And because he was so interested in numbers, he was actually noticing all kinds of patterns in numbers, like this one, which we still use to this day. But did you know that he was also the first one to argue not for a flat Earth, but for a spherical Earth? And not only that, but this spherical Earth rotated around some sort of central fire. So, that sounds pretty close to the truth. Yes, it seems he did a lot better than the philosophers before him, at least. So now we're going to move on to the Eleatic philosophers. Now, they're called the Eleatic philosophers because they were based in an area known as Elea. So, the Eleatic philosophers. And the first important Eleatic philosopher was Parmenides, who lived 540 to 470 before BC. There we go. So Parmenides' basic first contention was that knowledge is impossible unless it is knowledge of something that doesn't change. Because if you have knowledge about something that changes, and then it changes, then you no longer have knowledge of it. Since the world around him, nature, seemed to always be changing and in flux, Parmenides concluded that knowledge must have to do with something other than the changing world around us, something other than with the physical stuff that we have. Consequently, Parmenides' philosopher was that the real world must be something like Pythagoras' world of numbers that we just discussed, whereas the changing world around us is actually just an illusion. Whereas we interact with the illusory world through our senses, through our sight, our sound, our touch, and so forth, we interact with the real world with our reason. It is reason, in other words, that lets us see beyond our immediate sensory world. Behind all this, there were some very specific ideas about what being is. Remember monism from earlier? Well, this is the sort of monism that holds that not only is there just only one kind of stuff, one type of stuff, but everything is actually just one thing. It's all just, when you actually look at it, there's no parts to it. So for Parmenides, being is never created or destroyed. Being is never added to or subtracted from. And as a consequence, it never changes. Being just is. It's never becoming something else. And we'll come back to this whole being becoming thing when we get to a later philosopher. In other words, Parmenides' view is something known as absolute idealism. And absolute idealism is not just idealism in the sense that there is a world out there that is non-physical, that's a world of thought or numbers, like Pythagoras said, but it's absolute idealism, which means that that's the only thing that's out there. The only thing that exists, according to Parmenides, is this real, whole, one world that exists in the world of something like thought. the real world around, or sorry, the illusion, the sensible world around us is just an illusion. There is no actual physical world, according to Parmenides. Idealism in philosophy, let's see here. According to Parmenides, since we require that something doesn't change for us to have knowledge about it, Parmenides thinks that the real world must therefore be unchanging. Otherwise, we couldn't have any knowledge of it. And seemingly, we do have knowledge of stuff. At the very least, we have knowledge of, for example, 1 + 1 = 2. No matter what happens, it seems that we have knowledge of that unchanging thing. So he has a few sort of sayings here which are pretty handy. So, that which is, and cannot not be. That which is not, and cannot be. So he's saying that there's no coming into being and coming out of being, creation and destruction. There just is a thing. Furthermore, that which is can be thought, known, and truly named, whereas that which is not cannot be known or truly named. So in the same way that we can truly know that 1 + 1 = 2, we can't truly know, for example, anything about the sensible world. So if we want to say something like that tree is 42.5 meters tall and we just measured it, well, a microsecond later it's grown a tiny little bit and we're wrong. So we can't have knowledge about it. And not only that, we can't talk about the same tree twice. But we'll get more into that sort of idea in a later philosopher as well. So thus Parmenides was one of the first to emphasize the thought that thinking about something requires that it exists. When you talk about something, it is implicit that what you are saying when you is that you take that thing to exist. This solves a lot of problems for some later philosophers, but also causes a lot of problems for other people. The idea that when you say something like, I like that dog, that implies that there is a dog that exists that I'm talking about. Lastly, Parmenides emphasized that not only is the real world just one unchanging thing, but also that the unchanging thing can't be analyzed or broken down into parts. So if the world is just one thing, there's no pieces you can analyze by themselves. So you have this piece here, and this piece here, and this piece here, right? You can't do that. You have to take the whole thing at once, because there's actually no way you can truly divide it. So this is kind of similar to Mary Midgley's earlier idea about the organic model, the idea that you can't separate things out as if all of the universe is made up out of some Lego bricks that you can easily analyze. Thus, to conclude, Parmenides' answer to what is the world is that the world is unchanging and indivisible. It's a whole that we can get knowledge from through our use of reason. One of Parmenides' disciples, my namesake, is known as Zeno of Elea, and he was also an Eleatic philosopher. So Zeno of Elea took it upon himself. Let's write down his name. 490 to 430 BC. So he took it upon himself to defend Parmenides' two theses. What are his two theses? The idea that the world is really unchanging and that it is really indivisible. So in other words, Zeno set out to argue against the existence of multiplicity and motion. He did this by appealing to something called the law of non-contradiction. The law states that you cannot believe contradictory things. For example, something is either an apple or it's not an apple. You cannot reasonably defend the position that something is both an apple and not an apple at the same time. And so you have to pick one between those. You have to pick whether you think this is an apple or it's not an apple. You got to pick one. This law can be used to argue against someone by showing that the things that they believe contradict each other, so that they must be wrong in one of those. Usually this means showing how some less important belief should be cast away in favor of keeping the more important belief. For example, you can ask someone whether they believe that taxes should go down. And they'll say something like, yeah, I believe taxes should go down. But then you can also ask them, do you believe that schools should be funded more? And they'll say, yeah, I do believe that. In fact, that's a very strong belief of mine, right? And then using this method of non-contradiction, you can say, well, if you believe those two things, then do you realize that by believing this important thing, that schools should be funded more, you're actually also believing that taxes should go up? Because by believing this, it's implied that you believe this. And so therefore, you have a contradiction between these two beliefs. And since you care less about this belief than you do about this belief, then you should get rid of this belief and only keep these beliefs. So that's the basic way arguing from contradiction works. Sometimes this technique usually attempts to show that ideas internal to something you believe contradict themselves. So it's not so much a matter of comparing the more and less important beliefs, but rather showing how a single belief in of itself can be self-contradictory. So let's make some room. Okay. So in Zeno's case, as we mentioned, he wished to direct this technique against the idea of motion and the idea of multiplicity. Zeno did this by suggesting a few famous paradoxes to show how motion and multiplicity are self-contradicting. So the first main paradox of Zeno's is known as the line. Now, this one is kind of fun, and it's directed against the idea of multiplicity. Or in other words, the idea that you can actually break things up into parts. So his argument was this. Let's say we have a line, and the line is 1 foot long. Well, according to mathematics, we're able to divide this line in half. And then according to mathematics, again, we can divide it in half again, and again, and again, and again, and again, and again, until we basically have an infinite amount, or we have an infinite amount of parts. Well, mathematically speaking, what happens when you multiply anything by infinity? Well, you get infinity. So let's say we took this original line and wanted to ask, what is it multiplied by 2? Well, the normal answer should be, well, it's 2 feet, obviously. But if you analyze it this way, as Zeno points out, you actually get 1 foot times the amount of, sorry, not 1 foot, but let's say infinite parts times 2 is equal to an infinite length. So you can see here how believing that you can actually break things up into smaller and smaller parts leads to a self-contradiction. And Zeno wanted to show this by showing that if you do that, then you must believe that a line is both 2 feet long and an infinite amount of feet long, which, again, is a contradiction. What about the next one? Let's move on. So the next paradox of Zeno's is known as the runner's paradox, and it's very similar to the line paradox. So the runner's paradox goes like this. Here's a race. You got the start, and you got the finish. And here's a basic sort of point. Before you can get to the finish, you have to get halfway to the finish. There's no way to get to the finish from the start without going through the halfway point. Similarly, there's no way to get to the halfway point without first getting to the halfway point to that. And we can keep doing this. Halfway, 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 halfway. And eventually, you can keep going. And the argument here is, so the runner's paradox The argument here is against motion, because using mathematics, we can analyze the distance between the start and the finish, and we conclude that the runner has an infinite amount of stops he has to make before he can get to the finish. So, according to this, or according to the people who want to say that there is motion, the runner would actually never get there. And this is what Zeno was trying to point out. Now we have a third and final paradox, which is known as the arrow paradox. Now this paradox is a little bit more technical and hard to grasp on first reading. It's like the runner's paradox a little bit, but it's aimed at showing that motion is impossible as well. So the argument goes like this. Everything is at rest if it is at a place equal to itself. An object in motion is always in the present. Next, something that is in the present is in a place equal to itself. And lastly, therefore, an object in motion is at rest. So this seems pretty crazy, okay? So he's saying that something that by definition is at rest, it means that it's in the place that it is. So if something is in the place that it is, that means it's at rest, according to Zeno. Now, an object in motion is always in the present. Well, that's obviously true because everything is in the present. And tucked away in this is that a sort of dilemma. Either an object in the present is in a place equal to itself, or it's not. But nothing can be in a place that it's not. So, according to Zeno, it must be in a place equal to itself because it's in the present. Now, if that's the case, then something which is in motion, and therefore in the present, is in a place equal to itself, and if it's in a place equal to itself, then it's at rest. So you see, this is the arrow paradox. It's the idea that an arrow is both moving and not moving, and you get that if you try and use logic to figure out what motion is. This is probably my least favorite, as his reliance on the definition of rest being a place equal to itself is a little bit, tenuous, but I digress. In any case, whether he was successful or not, Zeno wanted to show that if you use mathematics and logic, you cannot prove the existence of multiplicity or of motion. In fact, on the contrary, if you try and use math and logic, you find out that multiplicity and motion are impossible. The next philosopher on our list is Heraclitus. And he lived 435 to 475 BC. Heraclitus, 435 to 475 BC. He departed from the Eleatic philosophers in a big way by basically taking the opposite position. So remember that the Eleatic philosophers' position was that everything is just being. It's not becoming. Whereas Heraclitus' position is that nothing is actually stable and being. Everything is just becoming. It's always in a state of flow, of flux. So it's fitting because Heraclitus was a bit of a grouchy aristocratic man, and he famously opposed democracy because according to him, all men are bad, which, is not necessarily incorrect in many cases, but another famous quote of his is that you cannot step in the same river twice. So imagine that there's a river, and there's bits of water going through it. When you stick your foot into the river and then pull it out again, those bits of water change place and they go downstream. And the next time you stick your foot in the water, well, that sucked. Interestingly enough, this actually goes to my point. So my recording device just ran out of memory, and because of that, we have this hard cut here. But I think I actually ran out at quite the perfect time, because as I was just trying to explain, things, according to Heraclitus, are always in motion. So as I was saying, if you stick your foot in a river and then take it out, and then try and put your foot back in, then it's a different river. And funnily enough, there's actually literally a different river I had to draw because the memory ran out. So here we are. So the point here is, at least according to Heraclitus, that the whole world is kind of like this. The whole world is kind of like the river, where it's always moving, the water is always going, and you'll never be able to touch the same water twice in the same place. Maybe if you're lucky, you'll be able to touch the same atom of hydrogen and oxygen put together twice, but even that is very unlikely. So according to Heraclitus, that's just what the world is. It's this constant flux of becoming. And so each moment the world is changing, just like the river. But despite his view that everything was in flux and that permanence was an illusion, Heraclitus did think that there was some sort of overarching order to this constant flow. Under his view, the world was actually literally fire. So, perhaps it's more like a river of fire of some sort. And the idea here is that for him, fire is something that's always twisting, always changing, always consuming. And so he associated fire with the mind and said that this world fire was, in some sense, uncreated and eternal. It's just what the world is. The world is a fire that's guided by the reason of mind. Moreover, he held that, like I said, being associated with mind, this world is reasonable. It has certain laws to it. And his way of referring to this organizing power of reason was logos. Now, literally speaking, logos in Greek means something like logic. But in this case, he was using. It's understood sometimes as the word. In other words, the ability to use words is what governs the world. It's this fiery mind which appeals to the logos. Now, more mystically speaking, this fire, this logos, in Heraclitus' point of view, in some ways called on people to see the illusion of the world. And what is that illusion? The illusion is that people mistake what is actually impermanent for something that is permanent. They think that there's actually real permanent things out there, and the fire of the world causes them, or calls on them, to sort of give up that belief. Now, I should also mention that this word logos here makes an appearance heavily in Christian thought, and that's because Christian thinkers early on actually appealed to a lot of the Greeks to develop their thoughts or draw thoughts from. And so the word logos is a very important topic in Christian theology. Now, that being said, this isn't a philosophy of religion class, so we can't actually get very deep into that connection. But if you're interested, you can take a philosophy of religion class as soon as we offer it, hopefully in the next term. Let's see here. Now, departing a little bit from the monists, let's move on to the pluralists. So the pluralists were, as opposed to the monists that we talked about earlier. And the first important pluralist we're going to cover is Empedocles. Empedocles. And he lived around circa 450 BC. That just means we don't really know when he was born and when he died, but we know the general idea, so we write C dot, which stands for circa, which basically just means around this time. Now, Empedocles took the view that the world wasn't just made up of one thing, like all the monists did. Instead, he took the view that the world was composed of many different elements, air, fire, water, earth, neither one of them being more fundamental than the other. So you can't break down earth into water, or you can't break down fire into air. They're completely separate things, according to Empedocles. Besides this view on what the world was, Empedocles also took a view on how it was organized. Now, according to Empedocles, his philosophy was that there's these two forces in the world, love and hate. And these forces account for the motions and of the various elements. Now, following Empedocles was Democritus. Democritus. And he also lived circa 450 BC. Now, Democritus was the one who championed the philosophy that the world is made up of atoms. Now, let's slow down a bit here. Atom. So, a means un, and tom means cuttable. So basically, Democritus's idea is that when we look at the world, let's say this is the world, we can sort of identify parts to it. So here's a part, and here's a part, and here's a part. But we can also keep going. So now we can identify another part and another part. And whenever we identify these parts, we're kind of like cutting the object up. But eventually, if you keep on cutting it up and analyzing what's the smaller and smaller bits, eventually you'll come up to this one thing that is completely what it is. There's no more dividing it up you can do. And this certainly inspired our modern day conception of what the world is, atoms made up of protons and neutrons. But notice our modern day conception is breaking down atoms beyond just the atom. So they're cutting up the atom into these parts, whereas Democritus didn't have any idea about that. He just said there are these things called atoms, and they're the things that you can't break apart any longer. So Democritus was a materialist, like the Hylacists. So his view was that the only stuff in the world, what the world is just these atoms. And so he has a famous quote that attests to this sort of opinion of his. By convention cold, by convention hot, by convention sweet, by convention bitter, but in reality just atoms and void. And so that sort of speaks to this sort of materialist or Hylasist point of view, that ultimately all there is just atoms and void. Now, he, besides being a materialist, was also something called a hedonist. Now, hedonists basically believe that there's only one thing that is good and there's only one thing that is bad. Now, the good thing is pleasure. And the bad thing is pain. So they associate these things directly with ethics, so that when you're talking about ethics, there's no gods or anything like that to appeal to. It's just the stuff in the world is atoms, and the only good you can have is pleasure, and the only bad you can have is pain, and that's all there is to it. Now, even to the modern day, some people still see it this way, but again, that's digressing perhaps beyond being a little bit too detailed than we need for this lecture. So, moving on from Democritus and Empedocles, we have another pluralist. Now, this guy, he was creative, and I kind of like what he did. His name was Anaxagoras. Anaxagoras. And I call him a pluralist because technically he's a pluralist, but in some ways he was kind of having his cake and eating it too between monism and pluralism, because Anaxagoras, first of all, was the first Athenian philosopher, and in principle he was a pluralist because he believed that the world was made up of different stuff. So, but that stuff is, the way it's made up of different stuff is a little bit more complicated. So his way of getting both unity and multiplicity, both pluralism and monism, was by stating, and this was kind of his main thing, everything contains everything else. So this may seem like a little bit of a strange claim, but let's consider it for a moment. Anaxagoras' main argument for this is, how could something come out of something it is not? So for Anaxagoras, it just made no sense that out of nothing something can appear, and that seems intuitive to a lot of people. So he's basically saying that within everything there's the information required to make everything else. So to imagine this, we can consider like a very small seed that has all the information required to make a huge tree that is seemingly way more complicated than the seed itself. The universe, according to Anaxagoras, then, is kind of the same. At the beginning of the universe, there is just one thing, and in that thing was mixed up pretty much everything else. So like the information required to make everything you see in the world was in there, all compacted. And the way Anaxagoras thought that the world progressed was basically by a series of divisions or separations. So some of the properties express themselves more in this one, and some of the other properties express themselves more in this one, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to keep going, but you get the idea. And so what is clever here is that Anaxagoras is avoiding the problem of creation and destruction by sort of replacing it with the idea of separation and unity. So when something is separated out of the whole, such that its properties are like the majority, let's say, vote inside of that object, then the object will look that way. And so we say in that case that it is being created because it wasn't there before, and now it seemingly is. But according to Anaxagoras, it's not being created, it's just being separated out of what's already there. Same thing then for destruction. If you have something that's clearly its own thing, but then it disappears and you can't find it anymore, Anaxagoras says it's not being destroyed so much as it's being mixed back into the universe. What he gets by doing this is the ability to say that there is something that is stable that we can have knowledge of, because all the information is still there, it's never being destroyed. So when you have knowledge of that information, and maybe you got it because you paid attention to it when it was expressing itself. And when that thing gets destroyed, it's not as though that information and that knowledge also gets destroyed. It's still there because all the information is staying intact. As far as his view on the solar system goes, Anaxagoras did claim that the sun was a ball of fire and the moon was made of earth. So he got that right, but that got him into a little bit of trouble because back in the day, the sun and the moon, they were supposed to be gods. So, they're not supposed to be balls of rock and fire, and that kind of lowers them. So he kind of got into a little bit of trouble with that, but in any case, with that, this concludes this lecture on the Presocratics. We have covered all the major Presocratic philosophers, although there are many others. So we've covered the ones in our textbook. and said a little bit about what each one believed. Central to all of these thinkers was the central question: what is the world? We have said that the hylacists think that everything is just stuff, be it water or air or something else. We've said that Pythagoras tried adding in a world of numbers, which is separate from the world of stuff. And we have the Eleatics capitalizing on that, saying that, in fact, the only thing that there is that world of numbers that never changes. And there's other things in that world, too. Now, they said that that world is unchanging, so having an entirely separate world from the one we see was helpful. Now, countering the Eleatics, we had Heraclitus and his school of becoming, right, which held that instead of everything just being and staying the same, everything was becoming and always changing, like the river we discussed about. And lastly, we had the pluralists, which wanted to show that the world was made up of many different things, such as Democritus with his idea of atoms. And despite what the Eleatics or the Heracliteans might want you to think, it is a bunch of different stuff. So, with that, this concludes this lecture. I'll see you next time in our next lecture, where we cover Plato's story, Euthyphro. See you there.